interest on this, if you remember, this is actually the third time that I have spoken to this chapter on the issue of standards development. And it's been in the past. It was Bob Brandis and Mark Towers welcomed me to that training facility. I forget exactly where it was, in the outskirts of Vegas. And I had spoken on the whole issue of standards. And Mark and I have communicated many times on this issue. So it's always great to talk to this group. And as anybody knows, I did see the description. I don't know if I'm the Santa Claus of standards. I can be somewhat of a jolly elf, I guess, or politically incorrect, a jolly holiday figure, I guess, but I'll do my best on that one. I did see the description. But what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the whole issue of consensus standards and how it can improve your occupational safety and health performance. And I'm not going to sit here and pontificate and lecture to you, because you're all OSH pros. And I look at the people on this. I know 3/4 of the people that are listening to me today, and you all have tons of experience. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how standards work, how they can be applied, and how you can potentially use them in your own workplace. So if we move on, and this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, hey, how do OSH pros use these standards? And I would say this is one of the most common things that I get. Why should I care? I get this all the time. Why should I care? What's the relationship between industry consensus standards and regulatory standards? Big thing. I get on this all the time. I follow CFR 1910 or 1926. Your standards, they don't mean anything. And I'm going to say, when we get into this a little bit, there is some truth to that I learned the bitter truth on in the last couple of years. We'll talk a little bit about that. And what are some of the common issues and concerns with using these standards? So as I said, what is our learning objectives? We want to basically learn about our standards, how they're applied, how we use them to mitigate hazards. And I think that's an important point. I don't want people on this group are going to say, but I think there's a big difference between a hazard and an exposure. And I think that the terms are used too many times as the same thing, and they're not. So if it's one thing I would say when we're talking today, I think there's a significant difference on that. And then we're going to look at the capabilities on how we use these standards and how we look at work-related hazards and exposures and hazardous working conditions. And what we will talk a little bit about is when we talk about the relationship between consensus standards and regulations, which has been a big thing. I would say this is one of the most common questions that I have heard, as Dr. Sam pointed out, in my almost 30 years at ASSP at this point. So, but let's think, so when we're meeting today, what are we talking about? And that is we're exchanging ideas and thoughts. And so what do we use when we want to form the basis for a decision? So first thing is, and we all do this, and that is we go to the regulations. And I would say, if you look at what ASSC and ASSP has done in the last couple of years, this is where I want to make this point. What was our approach for many, many years? And that is, if you read, it's like, OSHA is one thing, but you want to use our standards. If you use our standards, you're fine. And over the years, one of the very important counselors to me on this issue happens to be on this call, and that was Janet Byrne from our marketing department. And she said, Tim, if you look at what our members say, we don't want to hear that. We have to use the rules. We have to use the law. The question is, how do we use the standards to supplement the law? And I think that's a very good approach and a difference. So that's something that we actually had changed from what we did for many, many years before. So regulations first thing. Memory from a course taken years ago. Now, I don't know what you think, but I still remember stuff. So I got my master's in safety. I think Tim Potteroff is from the Northeast Illinois chapter. I'm a member of that chapter too. I went to Northern, and Earl Hansen, if anybody, and I think there's probably people on this call that remember Earl Hansen. He was a professor out there, and I learned an awful lot from that individual, maybe more. Unbelievable. To this day, I still remember stuff that Earl taught me on the whole issues of risk assessment and the issue of risk versus exposure, which was something that he talked about ad nauseum. So that's that type of thing. Phone a friend. And we can remember, Sam Liebarger said he's known me 30 years, and I've called Sam Liebarger before in the past and said, Sam, I'm running an issue in Nevada. How do I address this? And Sam, being the walking book of knowledge that he is on training and safety, was able to help me. And that would be the other thing that we want to look at. And then finally, I'd like to say that our standards are first, but I don't think they are. And that is, I'm going to look at the consensus standards to see what's in there that gives me a benchmark that we can operate against. Now, when we look at these, remember, what are we saying with this slide? What is a consensus standard? And that is, think of it this way. What we're talking about is a whole group of people got together and they came to an agreement. Now, it doesn't mean that it's absolutely the best agreement, or it's the only agreement, or it's the only agreement that matters. It's the agreement that they reached, and it reflects that consensus. Now, one thing I think is important on this is, I hear this all the time. I got a note on this the other day. The people that write these standards don't know what they're doing. They don't have any field experience, and they're a bunch of people sitting behind a desk. I'll tell you right now, that's malarkey. The people that write these standards generally have a lot of experience and a lot of background and expertise. Now, you may disagree with their contentions, and that's your right, or think that they don't know what they're talking about, and that's your right. But to say they don't know, they have no background experience, that I would say is not correct. Most of them have significant experience. And then the procedures, and that's the resources are developed, and we have to go through an absolutely brutal process to write a standard. So for us to write a standard, it's measured literally in years, not in weeks, not in months. It's measured in years. One individual or one organization can hold up the development of standard by months, or even a year. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So I think this is an important slide, just so people understand that. And if we move into this slide here, how are standards developed? And that is basically the topics approved, and that can take a long time. So our A10 committee for construction demolition, they generally will not approve a project for a year to 18 months. And why? Because they are always arguing over what should be in the scope. And here's an example right now. So we have a standard out there right now, which is being written on heat stress. And for people in this chapter in Vegas, I know this has been a significant issue for people in work sites and operations in the Vegas and Nevada areas, work stress. Well, what happened is we have another group on the committee that wants to have cold stress also, and they want to have both standards they want to have one standard, which is going to be written to address hazards and exposures on construction demolition sites resulting from, for want of a better term, bad weather, whether it's hot or cold. Now, one group on the committee says absolutely not. They're similar in approach. They're both weather related, but they deal with different hazards, different exposures. The remediation techniques are different, blah, 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 potentially different geographic areas completely. How much heat stress, for example, is there in Alaska? There actually is some on occasion. But the point is, they've been fighting on the scope now for almost a year. And just to give you an idea on that one, it took us almost 10 years to write a scaffolding standard. The big issue on that was the issue of fall protection, fall restraint. And what's the difference on that as far as, different types of guarding systems and rails. So that took 10 years to write that standard. After that's done, then we put the committee together, which can take a long time. The document is written. And then after that, then we have to go out for public review and votes. And that can be a long, drawn out process. It can be as quick as 6 months, and it can be as long as a couple of years. So we wrote an A1040 ergonomics, cumulative trauma disorder in construction. It took almost 3 years to go through 268 pages of comments and work with everybody. It's just the nature of it. And then after all is said and done, it goes to ANSI, and then hopefully they say, hey, yeah, you guys did a great job. Your standard's approved. But as I said, I got the thing that's thought about this. It's measured in years. Role of a standards developing organization. And this is an important one too. So if it's one thing, so I talked a little bit on this, ASSP, we manage the process. And the process, just so people are aware, probably half of our committee membership are made up of non-ASSP members. They represent organizations. So what am I trying to show with this slide here is that ASSP does not write the standard. Now we can and have weighed in on technical stuff, and we have done that. It's been few and far between. In the 30 years I've been on ASSP, I probably weighed in on technical language a dozen times, but it does happen. But what we want to do is make sure that we meet the rules. But an important slide with this to remember is when you go through this, how many of you people out there, when you deal with sales or marketing people from other companies that come to see you, say this product is ASSP and ANSI certified? That it's one thing I should say on our discussion today as a discussion item for you, should make your ears go up right away, because ASSP and ANSI do not certify products. So we do not certify the Tim Fisher fall protection harness. And if somebody tells you that we do, that should make your eyes go up right away. Not saying that it's a bad product, but it's just something that you should consider. And I mentioned also, what's the role of ANSI? This feeds right into the slide that I just talked about. So when we talk about ANSI, think of it this way, it's a facilitation body. All these organizations belong to ANSI. We do, and a lot of the groups do. And so what we do is we pay them dues. And what they do is they accredit us to put together national voluntary consensus committees, and we write national voluntary consensus standards. ANSI then at the end makes sure and says, you guys met your rules or you didn't meet your rules. And if we didn't meet our rules, they won't approve the standard. Has that happened to ASSE? Yes, it has. They have not approved standards of ours at times or held up the approval because they saw something that they did not believe met our rules. Generally, it deals with balance issues on a committee. So in other words, the committee can't be made up of Tim Fisher, Bob Brandis, and Sam Liebarger, us three. We all represent one single business industry, and then we all write the standard and try to send it in. That won't fly. So we have had our standards held up at times, and it's few and far between, but it does happen. But remember one thing, if you see that ANSI approval on a standard, it means you're looking at consensus standard. And what do I mean by that? What am I talking about? The National Fire Protection Association, those are ANSI standards. ASTM are ANSI standards. ASHRAE, all these. The reason why they don't put the ANSI name in front of it, and for example, ASSP does, is because the truth of the matter is they're an awful lot bigger than us. So the National Fire Protection Association probably sells $40 million worth of standards and standards related training each year. ASSP doesn't do near that much. If we're lucky, about 1.7 million total, and for all that stuff. Now don't forget, that doesn't mean we made that amount of money. That means that what our total revenue generation was. And then from that, then you got to pay, royalties and staff and prep costs and all that. So does ASSP make a few bucks on standards? It does. Do we make a killing on it? No. And I think that's an important thing to note. But when you look at a standard, remember, just because the ANSI name is not in front of it, doesn't mean that it's not an ANSI standard. We put the name in front of it because we think it carries weight and it gives us more recognition. But, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but if you look at this slide here, what are the cardinal principles of the ANSI system? Due process, consensus, basically transparency and openness. Those are the four things. And I think ASSP, we have definitely tried to strive to meet those. Have we made some mistakes? Of course we have. I'm not saying we never have. We have lost a couple of high profile appeals over the years, and we've won some high profile appeals over the years. I think our best example is we won our A1040 ergonomics appeal. And that was a tough one. And we've lost appeals as well. So I'm not claiming that we've never made a mistake. We have. But I do think we've tried to fall within these four areas, and we've tried to do that. One thing that's important is to how, and I get this a lot, how do I interpret the name of a standard? So if we look at this one, ANSI ASSP Z117.1, 2016. What does that mean for people on this call? Why do you care? So if you're looking at that name, there's actually some interest here. The ANSI name is in front of it. That meant that it went through the Institute. They did a final review and a final check, and that the standard is a voluntary national consensus standard, which is approved under the National Standards Institute. The next name means ASSP, but it could be anybody there. It could be ASTM. It could be NFPA. That means that is the standards developing organization of record that they wrote the standard. So if you're working on compliance and stuff, think about this. So you're looking at a standard. I know that it was approved by ANSI. You look at the acronym. I know what the developing organization is. Then you're going to look at the number. And if you see a Z, now the ANSI naming nomenclature has really changed over the years. Many years ago, Z meant it was a safety standard. Now they've gotten away from that, but still most safety standards, carry a Z. Construction standards still carry an A. So A10 are construction standards, A92, which is the lifts, that type of thing. And then what will happen is you'll see the number 0.1 that tells you it's the first standard in that series. And that's one thing to know. So if you're looking at a consensus issue and a compliance issue, if you see 0.1 or if you see a 0.6, it means that there's 5 standards or documents that were written before it. And that's a good thing to know. And then finally is the year of approval. Big thing I run into on this. So I talked to you a little bit on your eyes go up if somebody tells you something's ANSI certified or ASSP certified. This is another one. If the year of approval is 1976, I had this yesterday, so this happens all the time, should make your antenna go up. Wow, I wonder if there's been another standard in the last 44 years that addressed this issue. The odds are yes. And the reason why they asked me about 1976 is because it was a standard which is cited by reference by a government agency. Remember, when government references a standard, they reference that standard in time. So that's an important thing to remember. In the US alone, this slide here, what am I trying to show with this slide here? So we have about 95,000 different standards. Some are done through ANSI, some are not. There's about 450 standards developing organizations. About 20 of them are the largest, whereas ASSP fall in that. I'd say we're probably in the middle of the pack. I would say we're a significant developer of industrial safety standards, but if you're talking about the size of organizations, there are far bigger organizations than us. I mentioned some of them: the National Fire Protection Association, the American Society of Testing Materials, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. What do they produce? They produce boiler and pressure vessels, the elevator code. They have cranes, all those. ASHRAE, and I don't know if we have any refrigeration engineers on here, they write all the HVAC standards. So there are some really big players out there that write standards, the ICC, the International Code Commission, all that. So if we're talking about use of standards, ASSP, we're a middle level. And this is an important thing for people on the call, because what does that mean? That means if you're talking about occupational safety and health, there's a lot of standards that are developed by ASSP that impact you as an OSH professional, and ASSP is not writing it. So I think that's what we're trying to show with this one. There's hundreds of committees that deal with that one. I mentioned this here, and this is just a little bit of an example why I think it's important. So I mentioned ANSI, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. People on this presentation, where is your interest in this? I mentioned this: boiler and pressure vessels, elevators, escalators, cranes, very important. I can't even tell you how many ASSP members asked me about cranes. That's B30. Those are the B30 standards. There's the ASSP standards, which I mentioned. We're a mid-level size developing organization, but I think we're a very significant player in industrial safety standards. There's the American Society of Testing Materials. So one thing I would do, I don't want to give a plug for another organization, but I will. I belong to ASTM at $75 a year. I belong to 5 different committees. I belong to occupational safety and health. I belong to working surfaces. I belong to environmental, all these. So they write some really specific standards. So ASTM standards you see an awful lot is what's the coefficient of slip resistance on working surfaces? And is it 0.5 on dry surfaces or 0.5 on wet? And what's stiction? If anybody on this call can explain stiction to me, please do so. I've been following this for 30 years and still don't understand it. That's the ASTM. There's the International Safety Equipment Association. They write a lot of standards that impact people on this call. And by those, what do I mean? I'm talking about the PPE standard. So they write the eye and face protection standards, hard hats. They do stuff on first aid kits. We actually sell these standards for ISCA. So we do those as well. And then finally, the National Fire Protection Association. I would say one thing, NFPA and us have gotten into some discussions at times on scope. They are a huge developing organization, and they have really gotten into industrial safety standards. I'm not telling you they don't know with with NFPA 70E, the National Electric Code, obviously the egress code, those type of things. They impact everybody on this call. One thing that's of interest on this is NFPA standards. You can see them for free on the internet. They're one of the few that can. The other one is the B56 standards, which are the forklift and material handling standards. NFPA standards, you can look at them and read them and all that, but you can't copy them, save them, or print them. Will ASSP do that maybe down the road? Maybe. We're not at that level yet. We're not, like I said, we're not near the size of a developer that NFPA is, but maybe someday down the road. This slide here, what am I showing on this one? Tech reports. I thought you guys were talking about standards. We are, but don't forget, under the American National Standards Institute, you can really do 2 different documents. You can write a standard, and then you can also do something which is called an ANSI Registered Technical Report. And we do write registered technical reports. So for example, as I show on this slide, we have one here on management of autonomous vehicles. We do a tech report on prevention through design for the construction and demolition industry. And so we do write tech reports. What does it mean? They're not a standard. It means they still have legitimacy. There is some teeth to them because they are registered with the American National Standards Institute. A lot of organizations now write tech reports as opposed to standards because it's easier as far as some of the language you write. ASSP's preference is obviously with a standard, but you can use a tech report if you think it's an emerging area. Maybe there's not enough technology. Areas where we are writing tech reports, people on this call might be interested. Drones is one of them that we're looking at writing a tech report on right now for construction demolition operations. The FAA has some rules out there, but we don't have enough, I think, technical expertise. And this is what the committee would say, actually, not me. The committee doesn't believe we have enough technical expertise to write a standard on drones. So that's an example of what we're talking about. Compliance and enforcement. This is always an important thing here. Think of it this way. When we talk about a standard, can the government enforce a standard? Yes, they can. And they do it primarily in what they call a citation by reference. Probably the most common example is the Z87 standard, at one time written by ASSP. And so what does the government says in 1910? You will use a eye and face protection device that meets ANSI Z87.1, or you will be able to prove that it does. Well, how many organizations want to go out there and do a bunch of testing on their the eye and face protection devices? I'll buy a Z87 protector. That's one way. Another thing you'll see is a 5A1, which is a general duty clause proceeding. And yes, they are used at times. Primarily, I've seen our confined spaces standard used to great extent with that, and also our lockout tagout standard. What that means is if the organization knew about it.
Yeah, I was just checking because if you guys got a separate one for venues,
so not on that. Yes. I'm sorry, we got somebody. Okay, yeah. So sorry about that. So if an organization is aware of a hazard and there is a standard that applies, potentially a 5A1 could be written against it. They're pretty few and far between. The most common that I see are actually what I would call in the areas of settlement proceedings. And by that, I mean, me and Sam Leibarger own a manufacturing company. We had somebody fall to their death. And as part of the settlement proceeding, we have to agree to implement a fall protection management system. Well, what are you going to use? You're going to use our ANSI Z359.2 standard. That's what you're going to use. And that's what we're trying to show with this standard. One important thing, standards by their very nature, unless they're specifically included by government, then this right here applies. And that is, we don't stop anybody from selling product and services that don't comply with the standard. And we get this all the time. Fall protection is a big issue on this one. So we get a lot of people, it's like, how can ASSP permit the Tim Fisher Company to sell non-Z359 compliance product in the US? We don't have that authority. In other words, it's known as antitrust. So that's one thing that we have to be careful of. So what did we talk about? So I did talk about how standards are developed, and I did talk about how they're used, and I talked about our philosophy and what is meant by voluntary if an accident occurs. I think I hit on that one also. In relation to compliance, I hit on that one also, I think, to some extent. National Voluntary Consensus Standards. What am I trying to show with this slide here? I talked about this, how the standards are used, and are they only meant for litigation? No, they're not. And in fact, most standards that I see are used to defend in litigation. So our A1034 standard for protection of the public is used all the time. I've seen that used by companies to protect themselves. I know of somebody that drank too much at a bar, climbed a fence, and then fell to their death into a pit in a construction site. Our A1034 standard was used to protect that company or help to defend them during the process. Why they had fencing around it, warning, and all this. And the standard, I'm not saying the standard won it, I'm not claiming that, but I'm saying that they were used, it was used as something to show that the company had made a good faith effort to try and meet both legal and professional obligations. And they did win on that one. How are standards such as standards used by OSH and regulatory agencies? I think I've beaten that one to death. And why should OSH professionals be interested in hopefully participate on committees? I hope I made my case during our presentation today. So I'm looking at this. I got about 10 more minutes, and then we'll open this up to some Q&A. So I know you told me to keep it to 30. I think we're still on our time limit here. If not, somebody throw some apples at me. I mentioned this already, standards versus law. Bob Brandis is laughing, so I guess he's going to throw an apple at me. And simply claiming to meet OSHA standards, the European standards, there's some issue always with that one. As I noted earlier, ANSI standards, as mentioned, they go beyond regulatory requirements. I think that's an important thing too. And I noted already, it's important to know the year of the standard. If it's one thing I can also say today, please, everybody out there, when you're looking at a standard, look at the year it's published. I cannot tell you how many times over the years I have somebody call me and say, my company is prepared to spend $100,000 to be in compliance with standard X from the year 1972. And I'm like, I just don't think that's a good idea. Also, I mentioned the earlier thing on ANSI. I've heard many people, I've heard at least 100 of these in the last 5 years, have written me and said, my company is willing and ready to spend significant resources to be in compliance with the ANSI 18001 Occupational Safety and Health Standard. That should make somebody's eyes go up right away. And why is that? That's because there is no ANSI 18001 Occupational Health and Safety Standard. There's a British Standards Institute 18001 standard, but not an ANSI standard. So that's some of the things that we're going from. I think I talked to some extent on how standards impact the profession and how they're used when we look at this slide here. We want to go beyond rules. We want to promote standardization. Augmentation, I think, is important. I gave a shout out to Janet Byrne on this call. I think that's important. Janet is, I think, is on our marketing team, but I consider to be a real important advisor on our standards team, primarily because I think she has a really good ear for what the end users are looking at. And she actually has a standards background. So she's really helped us on that as well. So I talked to great extent, I think, on the role of government. I think we have a good feel for that one, how they're used. And when I talk about different things, I did not mention NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Noted on this slide, they're kind of the coordinating body for, I think, a lot of standards, and we work with NIST quite a bit. And also there's something which is called the OMB A119, which is the Morrell Amendment to the Technology Transfer Amendment Act of 1995. Does anybody on this call care about it? No. But what does it mean? It means that when a government agency writes a regulation, they're supposed to look at a standard and then decide if it applies. And if not, could they potentially use it? So we're going to conclude with the presentation in just a couple of minutes, and I'll open it up for some Q&A. These are right here. So if you look here, these are our different committees, which we have. We have our A10 construction demolition. This is a huge committee, over 55 standards and projects. A1264, which I mentioned earlier, is the always fascinating issue of slips, trips, and falls, and primarily slip resistance. Z15, which is our motor vehicle operation standard. Z117, confined spaces. Z244, lockout, tagout. Z9, which is our industrial ventilation standard. And Z359, which is our fall arrest, fall protection standards. On this one here, I think this is important. So we have our Z10 standards, which right now, I think Janet can correct me, but I believe these are our top selling standards for both sales and training right now. We have our Z490 standards. These deal with training. I would say one thing, they're written really from the 30,000 foot view. And we have had issues from OSH pros that said, hey, this is nothing but a training standard with safety put in. I think there is some merit to that, but we do think it's important that there be a standard that talks about how you train in occupational safety and health. We have our Z hydrogen sulfide standard. This is such a niche specific standard, but it's a really unique one and a good seller. And of interest on this one, as I pointed out yesterday, sales on this standard are increasing again. And why is this a good thing? Not because of the revenue aspect of it, but that means that there's a lot of workers returning to work on these energy rigs and on these oil rigs. So we think that's a good thing. We have our catch-all, which is our Z590 that deals with total worker health and prevention through design. So we write a lot of standards through that. Then we have our two international standards, which are the technical committees. One deals with risk management, risk assessment. It's 262. And then we have 283, and that writes the 45,001 standard. So I did want to go through that one, give you a little bit of a feel for what we're doing as far as our standards. When we move into our conclusion phase of the presentation, some more touch points. When we talk about standards, it's important to know your clientele. So whether you have your own consulting business, whether you're working for a large corporation, whether you're an expert witness, know your clientele and know the people, and you better know the difference between standards and the law. This is a significant thing. What am I trying to show on this one here is, I think, just some good things. Also, I mentioned earlier on the whole issue of ANSI certification, that know the difference between accreditation and third-party verification. For Tim Fisher to get up and say, hey, my product is ANSI compliant, it's third-party certified. Oh, who certified it? Myself. Can they do that? Yes, under certain conditions, but you need to know what they are. I don't want to get too much into management systems, other than that we do have them. And this is an area which is really growing. I mentioned Z10, 45,001. So with this standard, on this slide, I just want to show that this is an area that is really, really continuing to grow. So I would say one thing on management systems, whether you have one or not, if you think they're bunk or not, they are here to stay. And I know for a fact that there's somebody on this presentation that has sent me emails in the past that said, Tim, this management stuff is a bunch of malarkey as far as the systems goes. This is nothing more than management from 55, 60 years ago, just packaged differently. I hear that, but I'm telling you, if we're talking systems, this is a concept which is here to stay. The global toll, I won't go into the numbers. I think if anybody saw the numbers released yesterday, fatalities rose in the United States. highest, I believe, in almost 10 years. COVID obviously plays a role in that, but also falls from heights is a significant issue also. This slide here, I'm just trying to show really when we talk about international versus domestic standards, they're really pretty similar, but I just wanted to make that comparison on this one, that it's an important thing to know when we look at that toll. But if you look at here, this is 45,001. And if you look at Z10, because I don't want to beat up on management systems, but an important thing, let me go back one more time. Take a second. Go back to Z10. You're going to see a lot of similarities. And I think this is just meant to show that management systems are here to stay. I would say one thing, we put out a lot of things on the differences between 45,001 and Z10. One thing I should have included on this, we have a really good website up now that deals with selection on management systems and which one you should use. Thanks to Janet Byrne on this call. That was her idea, and I thought it was absolutely outstanding. So with that, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Duran, I think I am at 30 minutes pretty much on the dot. I didn't want to go too far past. And now, if anybody has any questions for me, I'm more than happy to take a look at them.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Tim. It was good. A couple bits of housekeeping just before we jump into the Q&A. I've been going back and forth with our secretary, Derek Lynch, as the presentation went on, just to make sure that we're squared away for roster purposes. The only one that we're not sure of is in the participant list as a phone number only, ending in 7727. So before we jump into Q&A, if you are contestant number 7727, if you would say hi and just introduce yourself. You don't have, I just want to say, you don't have to be an ASSP member to be here, but if you would give us some details on who you are and what chapter you call home, that would be excellent. Moment of silence.
Actually, it's Christopher Davis. I am a chapter member, called in as well as computer. I was having computer issues, so called in so I could listen.
Thanks, Christopher. Good to hear from you, sir. And you're, you know, frankly, I don't have our roster memorized. Are you a Southern Nevada member?
Yes, I am a Southern Nevada member.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks. I do better with faces than names. Thanks so much, Christopher. So we'll kick off for questions from there. Bob Brandis, as per usual for his style, he's got a question ready to go. He's raised his hand in the chat box, and we'll open the floor for him. Go ahead, Bob.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
We hear you.
Okay. Just a quick question. What is the status of ANSI Z9.9? Because your website still says it's withdrawn.
It does. It was released for recirculation yesterday. It will be announced for public review on December 25th. As a subgroup chair, and you're actually, I think, the vice chair, Bob, there was an email sent to the subgroups today. Hopefully you'll see that if it hasn't been delivered later today. So the standard is out for recirc. It's been announced for public review. So if all goes well, this is what's going to happen. So it's been announced for public review. That'll run 6 weeks. So I think it ends like the first week of February. The final recirculation ballot is out to the committee. If all goes well and we have no other changes and arguments and complaints, which is rare under a standard, but let's say for argument's sake that happens, that means that the paperwork would go to ANSI probably about the middle of February. There are still 2 outstanding objections. If they remain, then the Board of Standards Review will look at it. It'll probably take another 30 days. If they are resolved, that means that ANSI will probably approve it within 72 hours. But let's say that they won't be. Where am I going with all this? Standards out for public review. It's out for recirculation. If all goes well, we'll close the process about the middle of February. Standard approved by the end of February, hopefully published sometime in April would be my guess. Yeah. So we are still selling the older version. It's noted as being withdrawn, but hopefully you're going to see a new standard in early spring.
Yeah, I just want to stress the importance of the standard because of this whole COVID thing. And the critical question of how effective HEPA filters are in removing the virus from airstreams. And so that's why I really consider the standard to be very important. So I assume you're going to update the website so it doesn't say withdrawn anymore. It'll say out for public comment.
Well, as of right now, what I could do is we could say it's still withdrawn. So until it's approved, it's still withdrawn. We could say, for example, withdrawn, standard currently being revised. I could do that, but I can't say it's withdrawn because the current version is no longer in effect. As far as ventilation goes, I agree 1,000% with you. So I did a COVID course for ASSP. This is just me. I don't want to tell a story for people on this group, but I will. I had somebody tell me our organization, it's not the same, but it is. And if you hear me out, you'll understand where I'm coming with on this. It's a commercial bakery. And what he told me was, he goes, our site is absolutely spotless. There's not a problem in it, and it's fabulous. I said, okay. So I knew this guy. We had taken the OSHA the trainer course with it. I went with him, and true enough, his commercial bakery looked wonderful until I asked to look in his HVAC ducts, and he had about literally a 1/4 inch of flour dust in each one. So I hit the duct, and a big dust cloud goes. I go, that is what we call a dust explosion hazard. I go, so if we tie that back to COVID, this is me. And I don't want to be getting off the subject here, but I know this is important to people in this crowd. I have a lot of issue because what do we talk about? We talk about 6-foot distances, masks, longevity of the virus on hard materials, on exit and entrance. And in my opinion, is that the ventilation question has been left out, which to me makes no sense at all because you're recirculating air. So I did talk on this one, but your question, Bob, I know the standard is important to you, and you're going to see it approved. I'm hoping by mid-February. The big question on it is if I get a lot of people saying we don't like the changes, but that's the process. But it's looking good.
That's great.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, next question. It was relayed via the chat box from Norman. I'll just read it verbatim, and Tim, you can respond to it. The preview feature that NFPA and others offer is essential. I have bought too many standards that do not do what the standard says. ASSP needs to figure out how to provide the capability. What are your comments on that, Mr. Fisher?
I would say I hear Norm's comments. For our standards, for example, we include the table of contents on our website, scope, function. If anybody were to write me and say, you know what, I bought this standard, it didn't do what I wanted, I want my money back, I'd probably deal with it on a case-by-case basis. Have we done what NFPA has done at this point? No. Do I think we might? Yes. But I don't think to me, I think it's a tough comparison from ASSP with $1 million in sales to NFPA with $40 million in sales. It's a totally different ballgame. So I hear what he's saying. I agree with him in concept. I just don't know when we would go to that. Do I see the utility of it? Absolutely. I just don't know if and when we'll go to that point. We have done our tech briefs also, if you read it. So we'll do a full tech brief on a lot of our standards. We just did one on A1033, which is the multi-employer worksite, and that we include scope, function, table of contents, where it's recognized by the government, and that. So that's somewhat the preview thing, and that you can actually have. So you'll see more on that. I'm not dodging Norm's question. I wish I could give a more definitive answer. I just don't know at this point.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Neil, Norm, if you have a follow-up, feel free to enter it in the chat box. So we'll pivot now to Neil. In the chat box, Neil said, I have 2 quick questions, just in the respective time. Neil, if you'd put forward your most important question first, we'll have Mr. Fisher address that. And then after, if we get through everybody else, we'll circle back to your second question. So either via chat or via voice, Mr. Upfer, the floor is yours.
Okay, so what I was curious about is you obviously mentioned ISO, and we see in the United States a lot of companies, for example, from Europe that will come in, put a plant here in the United States or acquire a US-based firm, and then you'll start to see like for that plant where they'll have ISO in terms of the matter of course, and we're obviously used to ANSI standards and things like that. Given the globalization and so on, is there any kind of coordination going on that if ISO comes up with a standard and ASSP, ANSI has a standard, that they're going to be somewhat compatible with each other, that they're not going to be fighting at cross purposes or anything like that? Could you explain that or not?
I sure can. So we actually are the tag administrator for two standards, or two families of standards representing the United States with ISO. So one is obviously 45001. That's the ISO Technical Committee 283. And the other one is the Technical Committee 262 for Risk Management and Assessment. The US component for 14001 environmental, and for quality 9001 is the American Society for Quality. So the US system is basically, we have a technical advisory group. We advise ANSI how to vote. And then what we'll do is we'll try also to do our best. So 45001, and you have a really good question. So on that committee, there was 80 voting countries. And to be honest with you, they could care less what the US's regulatory system is. They don't care. And, to tell somebody in Nigeria that, hey, in the US, they just don't care. And so I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm just giving you the fact of the matter is, on our tag, we got a guy who's a former head of OSHA and a brilliant lawyer. And he was trying to make the case on HAZCOM, for example. And, somebody from Belgium was like, we don't care about US HAZCOM laws. But so where am I going with this one? We try to do our best to make them be somewhat synergistic. 45001 is a good example of that. 45001 was really based on three documents. The OSH document, which is 18001, that's a British Standards Institute document, our Z10 standard, and the International Labor Organization ILO guidelines. So do we try to maintain synergy? Yes. Do we always? No. And I think depending on the areas that you can see, I hear what you're telling me, but if you want to talk about real inconsistency, electronics is one area where there's been a lot of problems, but we don't get in touch. Am I answering your question? I don't know, or if I'm speaking around it, but let me know. But are we trying to do synergy? Yes. Can we guarantee that they're going to be synergistic? No.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Excellent. So next up, Craig chimed in a question. He said, I have a question about runway friction. And Mr. Fisher, he said he relayed it to you via the chat box. If you can see your chat box, that's great. Or if you need me to have Craig
I
restate the
posted it
question,
up for everybody now.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I see. So the question is on runway friction. I was in the Air Force. I was in fire protection. I don't claim to be a runway, a friction expert. I am on the F-13 committee. F-13, though, that ASTM standard deals with setting of friction, but for working surfaces. And so, should terrazzo tile be measured 0.5 wet or dry with a something tester? So I hear the question. I think it's darn interesting. I don't know. I'm assuming, Craig, you're a pilot from this question, but I don't know.
Yes, yeah. Originally flying Tigers, now
Craig,
FedEx.
What did you fly, man? What did you fly?
Oh, lots of things. Civilian side, DC-8s, 7.4s, finished up with MD-11s at FedEx, and military fast movers, transports, everything.
Outstanding, sir. I like to hear that. I can always tell a pilot. I'll tell a quick story. I was on a commercial plane about 10 years ago. I felt the plane land, and I knew right away it was a fighter pilot that landed that jet. And I went up there, and lo and behold, he was an F-4 squadron commander from when I was at Zweibrücken, Germany, and he was shocked that I knew who he was. But side story there.
Yeah, it's technique. That's right.
That's great. Okay. We definitely want to make sure that society gets their word in too. So I'm going to share Janet's comment just for everyone's benefit. Just wanted to let everyone know that ASSP is offering a standards one-day virtual event that is free, from emphasis added, free for members on January 27th. The link, she included a link for details, and there are still spaces available. So as a chapter, we will definitely do our best to put that link out for our members, but a free one-day standards event for members, shared by Janet from Society. So Janet, thank you for chiming that in, and I will make sure that our membership has access to that link. Barring any other questions, kind of a speak now, forever hold your peace. Neil was able to chime in his second question that we put on the back burner. If nothing pops up, well, I'll give it 5 seconds if anyone wants to chime in over the microphone of a question, and if not, we'll go to Neil's second typed question in the chat box. T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay, so Neil's second question. What's the rough average in years for a standard? 5, 7.5, 10 years, etc.
It's a great question. And one thing I want to say, I was thinking of Norm Umberger when we were going into this. We just released the new Z359.1 standard yesterday, the fall protection code. It's free. So I wanted to point that out for Mr. Umberger. You can go download that, and it's on the ASSP website. So you can get that standard for free right now. And that gives you a guide to all the other ones. And it occurred to me when we were talking. So as far as development of a standard, average in years, 2 things. One, a standard is supposed to be revised every 5 years. If it's not, and ASSP has not been good on that, just because of the time involved, we try to be. If a standard is not revised in 5 years, it will be withdrawn by ANSI automatically, whether we do or say or send up smoke signals, it doesn't matter. So they will withdraw a standard on us at 10 years if there's been no action taken on it. We have no control over it. As far as development of an actual standard, I've seen them move really quick. By that in the world of standards, 2 years. And I've seen them take literally 20 years. So we're writing an 810-2 standard right now for construction training. It was originally proposed in 2003, and we haven't even gotten to ballot yet. So some of them move quick. We did our managed fall protection standard Z359.2 in about 28 months. So I wish I could give you an average. I would say probably from beginning to end, it's probably about 3 years. But it really depends on the complexity of the standard and the complexity of the issue. Back to you,
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. So Neil chimed in on a follow-up. As for time development, is there an average for how long it takes to develop a standard? You touched on that briefly with 359.2 being 28 months, but is there an average on time development for standards?
I would say probably, I think I said it depends on the scope and all that. 3 years is probably an average number. But, you know, I've seen standards develop quicker. There was just a standard release this week, if anybody saw it, the ISO 45005 standard, which deals with COVID-19. And that standard is free on the ISO website. And that standard was developed in about 8 months.
Okay.
You know, people can go and look at it. You can get it for free and take your thoughts and go from there. So it really depends on, but I'd say 3 years is a reasonable estimate.
Tim, taking what you just said, you go to the CFR and there are some ANSI codes in there that are from 1969, from when OSHA was developed, put together. What does that do to compliance issues? Should you, and you should go to the most current, but what about the reference issue, the legal standpoint? Am I making sense?
Yeah, you are. It's actually been a stink, and I call it a stink between us and ANSI. So ANSI has tried to do a repository of standards that are cited by the federal government. We have not participated in it. I personally think it's scary. So they reference, for example, the welding codes and the gas codes from the 40s.
Yeah.
Now, there's been big differences in welding, and I think that's pretty scary that you're going to go look at mixtures from 19. And so, you know, if somebody comes to us for an old standard, and we get them pretty common, we always tell them this: you buy the new standard, and we'll give you all of the old ones as historic documents. We'll give you all of them, but you got to have the most current one. But we have not participated in the ANSI database for that very reason, Sam. We think it's downright scary to be doing that. Our fall protection stuff, our original fall protection standard was written in 1992. That's an issue we've had with the government. You were on the board of directors when we wrote to the feds on this kind of stuff. They were allowing chest harnesses in this not that long ago.
Based upon what you just said, and
I don't know if I'm answering it. I would say you got to look at it, but you better make sure you have the more current standard. You can get some serious trouble, especially also if you want to do like the ACGIH, the threshold limit values, and look at the ACGIH levels from 1986. That's not doing you anything. So that's my own personal perspective, though.
From a professional standpoint, am I doing anything unethical by just ignoring the 69, 70, 42 and just the most current? standard?
Ethically and professionally, no, I don't think you are. In fact, the OSHA has got on their memorandum of understanding that if you are using a more current standard and something strange happens, the most you could be hit with is a de minimis violation. But attorney would have to weigh in more on that than I would. Adele Abrams, for example, I think most people on this thing know Adele Abrams. She's she's our regulatory counsel in DC.
Well, just based upon that letter and that status at that time, I just ignored ANSI. I see they're there, and then I go to the most current.
That would be me. I would always say, yeah, go with the most current document.
Cool. Excellent points. Okay, going to do a quick check for any other questions in the chat box. Again, so folks, we will relay the link that Janet Byrne provided for the free one-day standards event. We'll also give you a citation for the 45,005 COVID standard that Mr. Fisher mentioned. And
this is Dale. I had a quick question for Tim. There was supposedly a law, I think, that was passed by Congress requiring any standards that are referenced in regulations to be provided for free. Whatever happened with that, or did that go through, or do you know what the status was on that?
It's a good question. There is no law on that. It's being fought in the courts right now. So, and so here's the argument. It's a wicked legal argument. And so the argument is this, and that is, if a standard is cited in a law as law, so they say, for example, 87, not, hey, we suggest you go look at 810.8. No, if you cite a standard in law, a good example of this is NFPA 870E or the egress code. If you cite those in law, the argument has been made, the law is the law and you can't charge people for the law. Now, the standards development community has said that's a lot of nonsense. You had to pay for the law. I mean, 20 years ago, if you wanted a copy of the tax code, what did you do? You wrote to the government printing office and sent them a check for $20. It wasn't for free. They say, so they say that's nonsense. And if you think you can just sue for copyright because, the government said use this, we disagree. The town of Tim Fisher in Oklahoma cites our most current fall protection standard. We lose our copyright. Is that what you're telling us? So, long story is the I talked about. That's what talks about it. It's in the courts right now. The developers have lost at basically every level. So that's why NPA, for example, what Norm was asking, that's why they put their standards online. I would say one thing. We have failed miserably our ASSP having our standards cited by government as law. So in a way, what has been our most miserable failure is now our best success. So I'm not being facetious on that one, but it's true. I know I'm getting windy on this one, but it's an important question. So is there a law? No. Is it being fought in the courts? Yes. Have the developers lost? They have. And will it continue to be fought out? It will.
Oh, also, I gave you a little explanation of stiction in the chat box.
That's funny.
I'll love to read it. I've been dealing with stiction, the whole thing of stiction and 0.5. I've been looking at it for 30 years. I still don't understand it.
Well, I experienced it doing testing. Doesn't make any sense that a wet surface has got a higher coefficient of friction than a dry surface.
Yeah.
Well, so Tim, I screenshotted Dale's explanation of stiction. I'll pass it forward and see if it enlightens you in any further ways. So
I would love to read it. Yes.
we're at 5 minutes past our scheduled adjourning time. Tim, thank you so much. This has been a phenomenal blend of an informative meeting, a participatory meeting. We feel very fortunate to have you on board. Thanks for spending some time with us. Any other board officer closing comments that we need to get out to our members before we take off?
Two quick notes. Kramer's presentation on fall protection is January 21st. And in February, we're bringing in a local author who wrote a book on occupational safety and health in Southern Nevada from 1902 to the current. She had a book that just came out yesterday, Gambling with Lives, a history of occupational health and safety. Her name is Michelle Turk, and she's been reviewed by the society, her book. I can't remember who reviewed it, but one of our past presidents reviewed her book. Supposedly, Barnes and Noble will have it. I called yesterday and they didn't have it yet. It's $35, but you should have an interesting topic of the history of Las Vegas, including City Center, PepCon, the dam, some of the other issues that have happened in Las Vegas. So, and that's going to happen February 18th.
Cool.
So hope you guys in Illinois might be interested.
Thank you, Mr. Program Chair. I am grateful to see so many members from out of state attending as well. This is kind of an idea that started among some conversations among folks in our other Region 2 chapters, but we intend to keep spreading the word across our region and across society for these meetings. So by all means, for a note to our chapter members, if you feel like you want to invite anyone to these meetings while we're continuing to meet online, go for it. The more the merrier. I'm grateful that so many out-of-state folks did attend this meeting. So we're continuing on the third Thursday as usual for chapter meetings, and we will be trying to talk with folks for board positions and just little bite-sized ways, like I said, to help out as we move into our next program year. If you have an idea to make something better, that's how I ended up where I am. So please pitch in. And last thing is that I'm almost certain, I'm not speaking with board approval, this is just my personal opinion, that it is so much more efficient to have folks register through the events page on the website. Mark H. from Chapter Services at National has put together a really good tool for us on the boards. It helps with our attendance, it helps with our rosters, it helps just building commitment to the meeting. So I'm not certain, but I think come January, we're not going to send out the Zoom meeting code via the reminder emails. So just get ready, because I think that's where we're going. And I appreciate everyone that did register through the website. That's probably where we'll be going a month from now. Just to wrap up, thanks, Tim Fisher. Super informative. We appreciate all your insight. And for purposes of minutes, we will call ourselves adjourned at 9:08. Thanks, everybody. Merry Christmas.
Thanks, Tim.
That was a great meeting.
Good stuff.
Thanks a lot. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Recording is
Have a nice holiday.
recording stopping now.